or to ask it on an exam. Okay, so wherever we get on Thursday, we'll end the study guide. The study guide is online on Blackboard if you want to download a copy and then start putting in answers so you have more room to write. If that's your particular method, that's great. I'll update that on Thursday. I'll take off questions and terms that aren't going to be on the exam. The exam for ecology and evolution, you come in with something to write with. I give you the exam. You write on the exam. You give it back to me. You're free to go on that particular day. It's usually about 60 to 70% kind of short answer questions. I'll give you a graph. I'll give you an image. I ask you to interpret it, tell it how it relates potentially to concepts that we talked about in class. I might ask you to put together a couple concepts very similar to the types of questions that are here. And then the other portion of the exam is going to be multiple choice and matching type questions. So there'll probably be 20 or 25 multiple choice questions, and then we're going to have at least one matching section that's based on these different ecologists that you guys did for homework 1. And so I'll probably have a matching section with those ecologists where there's like half of them on there. I'll be like 10 points of match. And I have placed the answers, my answers to who those ecologists were, also on Blackboard. And so if you, by and large, you guys got all those types of ecologists correct. If you want to go back and refresh yourself on what each one of those people did and what I'm likely to ask you about, my answers to homework 1 are on Blackboard as well. Okay. Any questions right now about homework or about exam 1? Okay. We have a little bit more to talk about with evolution, kind of moving into the idea today of what are species and genetic differentiation, which is kind of the end result of evolution, is that you get new species, right? We talk about speciation, extinction, and adaptive radiation and how these processes are paired on geographic and kind of big geologic timescales at the end of class last Thursday. Today I want us to talk just a little bit about what that looks like on the small scale in process. And so there are a few interesting terms that we can start to apply to organisms as we see this breadth of differentiation that's starting to happen across an ecosystem or in 2 different geographic locations. So that's what we're going to talk about first. And then we're going to want to start to talk about plants in particular and what types of evolutionary adaptations do we see in plants. And some of them are really obvious. Some of them are pretty interesting when we think about it in terms of some broad categories of adaptations to things like temperature and light and nutrients. Sorry, my voice don't fall. Just taking a picture, right? If you got it. So we'll talk about some of these broad categories of adaptations that we see in plants. And then as we talk about each one of these things, we're going to highlight some interesting types of plants, like the carnivorous pitcher plants that you see here. I love this guy. They have like fangs. He totally looks awesome as just like a leaf morphology in general. And how do they fit into this kind of idea of evolutionary adaptations to challenges that we see in different types of organisms? And again, we'll talk about adaptations in animals many times kind of for the rest of the semester. But I want to take one day and think about plants and kind of appreciate that they're evolving and some of their adaptations too. It's not something that, again, we tend to think of as being so adaptive, but they are quite evolutionarily phenomenal in each specific in some cases. Okay, so I think in this class we've touched on what a species is, but I don't think I've given you the like straight up slide definition of a species. And again, when we think about evolution and when we start to consider biodiversity and community composition and populations for the rest of the semester in ecology, our base unit is the species. And so the species and the way that we define a species becomes pretty important so that we're all talking about the same thing. And we'll talk about some limitation to this species next, but in general, we have this biological species concept, or BSC. And it says that a species It's a group of organisms or individuals that share DNA, and because they share DNA, they share traits. They look and act very similar to one another because they have that genetic similarity. And in fact, they are so similar at the DNA and the trait level that they're capable of interbreeding with each other and producing fertile offspring. And so the classic example of this is that donkeys and horses are two different species. They're obviously four-legged herbivorous organisms that look really similar. They can actually interbreed, but they produce mules, which are sterile.
Yep.
Okay, so that's again, this classic example of these biologically differentiated species. All the different big cats that we see here in the picture are different species in the same genera. Okay, they can interbreed. Okay, you can get things like ligons and it's ligons and what is it? Ligons and no, whatever it is. I can't remember. What were you gonna say?
A liger.
A liger, thank you. A liger and a tigon. That's it. Thanks. You can hybridize these guys, but the offspring are like nobody wants to mate with them. Okay, they're like neither one. They're if they were to hybridize a lot, which they don't because they don't live near each other, other than in zoos, which is where that hybridization happens. They would start to be their own species of that hybridized organism because they don't share enough traits with either parent species to actually continue to interbreed.
Do ligers mate though?
I don't know, and I don't know if anybody has really tried it. But that you're getting to that point then when they might not actually be able to sustain themselves as a species. And again, that indicates that these are really different species.
Ligers have like serious issues.
Oh yeah, they're not like
health problems, a lot of mental problems. Like you look at like the pictures of ligers, like
Oh,
their
they look-
faces are like, ugh, like
they look bad.
They do not look very smart.
Right, and that's this idea of a fertile offspring, a sturdy offspring that can make it in the world. And so we start to see their different species. We have named somewhere in the order of 3 to 5 million eukaryotic species, the plants, the animals, the fungi that we have on Earth today. We recognize there's probably an order of magnitude more prokaryotic species, bacteria and archaea, that exist on the world with us today. 99% of all species that have lived on Earth are already extinct. And we have the current population of species on our planet, and that is a changing number. And some species are going extinct, new species are being formed. It's pretty well understood in conservation biology today that our extinction rate is exceeding speciation rate, that they're not in balance. So we're headed for a potential mass extinction event because our speciation rate right now is lower than our current extinction rate. Okay, this definition is great when we're talking about plants and animals and fungi and organisms that can interbreed and we can see if they make offspring. But there are some real limitations to this definition about what a species is. And so depending upon the field of research that we get kind of into the weeds about, we might use a slightly different definition of a species. And so there are some real limitations to the biological species concept. Essentially, it works great until you get into actual field ecology and you want to identify species and you start recognizing that there are all these different hybrids between the classic species that are in the taxonomic books or that are on the phylogenetic trees. And so first and foremost, the BSC doesn't work for fossil species. Fossils organisms, we have these remnants of, we have no way of interbreeding them. And in lots of cases, we have no way of getting DNA information in order to be able to say what was a species and what isn't. And so it's easy to mystify fossils. In particular, in dinosaurs, we have lots of questions about what do juvenile and adult organisms of the same species look like. And so we think actually today in the United States that a bunch of our dinosaur species that we have classified as species and have skeletons of are juvenile or immature of other larger species. As they mature over time, they get bigger. And those are really interesting hypotheses then about evolution and speciation. And they affect things like community composition and how we think about evolution of the current species when we can't even apply the species definition to the fossil system. The other thing that's really apparent is that lots of species do hybridize, that there is gene flow between organisms that we place in species definitions. And a great example of this that actually does happen out in nature are these growler bears. We have grizzly bears and polar bears that hybridize. And I will link for you on Blackboard this amazing Radiolab episode about growler bears. And they are known from people observing them in the wild several different times, even in like recent times, not even going back to kind of the mythos of different native peoples' cultures. But we know that they're out there. The question is like, how dominant are these hybridizations? Are they capable of hybridizing with each other? Are they going to be a growing portion of these populations over time as climate changes and these organisms start to interact more frequently? We just don't know. This type of hybridization breaks down our ability to define a species, and like what we thought was a species might actually not be two different species. They might actually be one with these subpopulations. Our ability to taxonomically classify organisms is constantly in flux. And we're constantly reclassifying organisms as we get new information. And that particularly relates to prokaryotes, which reproduce asexually. They don't even mate with each other to fit into the BSC definition. And so in prokaryotes, both bacteria and archaea and some of our unicellular protists and even some of our fungi that just go through a budding asexual process of cell division, we do it all entirely based on DNA similarity. And depending upon the group of organisms, if you're 95% similar in your DNA sequence, you're the same species. What we start to recognize is that even though your DNA can be quite similar, you might function very differently in your particular ecosystem. And is that just your expression that changes based upon environmental conditions? Or is that actually something that's unique to you as an organism? Are you your own species? And that's where this starts to get very gray and vague when we actually consider what makes a species, particularly with these prokaryotes. How different do you have to be before you are a new species? And usually a community of scientists working with an organism will agree on what they want the definition of a species to be. There are people that spend their lifetime trying to find new species, particularly of mammals, and then because you discovered it first and you publish it first, you get to name it, right? And so that can be very flattering for a person's ego. So again, there's lots of interesting stories about differentiating species. Again, as we look at more and more organisms closely, we start to see that there might be 2 or 3 species where we had named or observed one before. Okay. All right. The way that we get species separation, though, is when we have these genetic differences between populations. And again, you have to stop gene flow. You have to put in a geographic barrier or a reproductive barrier, remember allopatric versus sympatric speciation, in order to get these 2 things to be different. The process towards that split involves genetic changes between those populations. And there are gradations in that already exist in the organisms around us. And so one example of this is when we talk about clines. And a cline is a measurable gradual change over a given geographic region in the average of a phenotypic trait. And it's underlined by genetic differences in those populations. The environment has got different moisture, different pH. In the case of our data here with this little lizard species, as we change latitude, we change temperature. And because the temperature changes, then the organisms are going to look different or act different. They might be different lengths, they might have different coloration, they might have different amounts of body fat on them. And in this case, that gradient in phenotypes is due to genetic differences in the population. It's actually changes in the allele frequencies from the lizards that live at 28 degrees and the lizards that live over at 40 degrees. And because their genes are different, then they look different. They happen to be more of those genes in that location. Their environment is different and is selecting for those particular types of alleles. The question for ecologists and researchers then become, are these different species, okay? And like these lizards that live in these different locations might look really different, but they can interbreed with the ones in between, and the ones in between are breeding at either end of the scale. And so the genetics still has gene flow, and they're still mixing within this species. And that's interesting. That's interesting to continue to observe as a population of what is the point at which they do actually start to split and speciate, or will they always remain this kind of merged population with a variety of phenotypes that the environment then selects?
Do they have like the same DNA, like in different?
Yeah, their DNA is similar enough that they can interbreed, but at these few different loci that are subjected to things like temperature gradients, they express different genes either differently, or they have different alleles that are actually more prominent in those populations because they're better adapted to lower or higher temperatures. And so it's like, again, you could have like 99 out of 100 of your genes are the same, but that one gene is different at the two ends of your like temperature extreme. Are you different species? No, but we're going to call you a client. Okay. All right. This kind of, as the clients are on their way to becoming different species, sometimes we can start to identify that at the two ends of the extreme of that gradation of environment and genes, we can say that there are ecotypes that exist, where you have populations that are very adapted to local conditions. And the climb that we just looked like at the lizards, it was this nice straight kind of linear gradation change with temperature and latitude in what was happening with the lizards. In the case of these little mice, there's kind of two phenotypes. Okay, you can be dark furred or you can be light furred, and they live very near each other, but one lives on the scrubland side of the sand dune and one lives kind of on the sandy beach side of the sand dune. And because of those two different environments, it's really advantageous to be able to be camouflaged in your environment. And so there's gene flow. Some little mice run over and across the sand dune and interact with each other. But if you're a white mouse in the scrubland, you're going to get eaten. And if you're a brown mouse on the white sand dune, you're going to get eaten. And so there are these two different populations that are markedly different. And this is that idea of that disruptive selection, where within a population, the two extremes of the phenotypes are both selected for. And woe if you are a beige-colored mouse, you're not really camouflaged in either location. And over time, that might actually cause speciation, where there is a loss of gene flow across these sand dunes. These ecotypes, again, we might also call them in this case kind of geographic isolates if they become kind of permanently separated from each other. If a big road goes through with a seawall right along the top of the sand dune, we're going to break a gene flow between those two populations, and they're going to become subpopulations and potentially geographic isolates, where you have these geographically distinct species that are adapted to their local environment, and you started to finally restrict gene flow, okay? And they're on their way to becoming species. So again, if you think of this kind of pattern of speciation and increasing genetic differentiation in order to get different species, you start out with the cline, you kind of go to the ecotype, and then you finally end up with these geographic isolates. And then the final point of that change over time in genetics is two truly different species. Is everybody with me?
So, cline is just like a variation in like physical things.
Yeah, but it's based upon genetic differences.
Genetic differences, and then an ecotype is just where they're more suited to each other.
Yeah, where you start to see that like the ends of those clines are starting to get really adapted to the local conditions, which are quite different from each other. And then if you stop gene flow between those two ecotypes, you're going to start to end up with geographic isolates and potentially new species. It's like if we sent people to Mars, okay, they would be subjected to totally different selective forces. And even though there might be people coming back and forth between Earth and Mars, it's likely that over time, people that live on Mars and that are born on Mars would start to have very different traits, and different alleles would start to appear in more prevalence in their population. That's like a climb between Earth and Mars. If suddenly then we decide to declare war on each other, we become, geographic isolates between Earth and Mars. If we stop gene flow, stop kind of treating people.
But there wouldn't be an ecotype in that situation, right?
Probably not, unless you start to get different ecotypes of people that live on Mars.
Yeah.
And if you look again kind of at early human civilizations, we start to see local adaptations and things like skin color and height for the ecotype in which that person, that population of humans was living. As we've gotten globalization, then we've increased gene flow and we've mixed up all these traits again. Yeah, it's kind of cool. It's fun to think about it in people. Doesn't happen anymore, but it does happen in things like rabbits all the time. Okay, all right. Genetic differentiation in clines and ecotypes and geographic isolates are when we see changes in phenotypes and in populations and subpopulations due to genetic differences in those populations. That is different from phenotypic plasticity. And we brought this term up last week in our discussions of evolution, and now again you can kind of have the full-blown lecture slide about it. In phenotypic plasticity, we have one genotype, no difference in genetics, that responds differently to different environmental conditions. And that leads to then different phenotypes within a species. So a cline, we have different environmental conditions, that's the same with phenotypic plasticity. But in a cline, there's actually genetic differences in the organisms that are showing the two types of traits. In phenotypic plasticity, it's the same organism that because of its environment is going to express a gene differently and thus look different. Okay, there's no actual difference in its genetics in these two conditions. But because of those conditions, its expression rate of those genes changes and its phenotype is plastic over that range of conditions. And here plastic isn't this rigid substance, it's like saran wrap where you can bend it a whole bunch. Okay. In the pictures we have here, these are the same species of locust or grasshopper. Depending upon temperature and food conditions, it will be light skin color or it will be dark skin color. The same thing with these beetles. They can show the exact same kind of genetically identical beetles grown under different conditions will show a different phenotype. That's phenotypic plasticity. The expression levels of the genes and the genotype vary with the environmental conditions. So we can then talk about a norm of reaction, the continuous range of possibilities given one genotype. A cline is the range of phenotype possibilities given a whole bunch of different genotypes in that population. A norm of range is what's possible for one genotype. Within phenotypic plasticity, then, we can talk about two ways in which this plasticity can kind of be present in organisms. And in organisms like plants, we tend to see that there is what we call developmental plasticity. That as the organism is developing, certain genes are expressed, turned on or off, and you get an adult organism that looks one way, okay, like with the beetles. Something was different in their environment. In the orange and the black beetle, the adult is orange or black. In the case here, we've had different exposure to light of the same little Arabidopsis plant, and it either grows kind of tall with big leaves or it splays out to the side with little kind of thin. And developmental plasticity, we're talking about irreversible phenotype changes due to environmental conditions. Something gets turned on or off, or an expression level gets set, that determines forever how that organism is going to grow and mature and respond to its environment. It can't flip the switch back and suddenly start growing big and tall, or go from being orange to being black. And in this case, usually what we see in developmental plasticity is that as it's growing, there's a range of possibilities, and then depending upon conditions, something gets set in a certain way. And it's usually due to an allocation of biomass in a particular way. And once that's done, you've committed yourself to a particular growth pattern. whether again it's height in terms of plants and leaf allocation, or if it's, skin coat and color in different types of organisms. In the case of what's happening here, under really low light conditions, we see that total plant biomass goes way down, okay? And under high light conditions, the plant biomass can be a lot bigger, okay? But at the same time, if we look at kind of leaf area to kind of per plant gram tissue, there's a lot more leaves per total plant in the low light conditions. It's trying to get more light. And under high light conditions, it doesn't need to make as many leaves to get the same amount of light, so it doesn't. It can allocate that biomass instead to growing big and tall and having big stems rather than needing to make a whole bunch of leaves like the low light. But once those genes are turned on for a particular growth pattern in this plant, it's stuck. You can't take that low light plant and put it in high light and it'll start growing like a high light plant. That won't happen because that biomass allocation is already taken place. It will grow in that pattern for the rest of the time. Okay. In some organisms, particularly in lots of types of vertebrate homeotherm organisms, we see a different pattern in which they can, in their particular phenotype, one individual over the course of its life can reversibly change in response to changing environmental conditions. And that's known as acclimation. And so we defined adaptation as something that allows an organism to be more fit for its environment. And that's defined by their genetics. And because different organisms will have different genetics, they will have different adaptive traits. In acclimation, we're looking at the ability of one individual genotype to respond to changing environmental conditions. And in acclimation, it's reversible. You can acclimatize to cold weather conditions. You can then, in summertime, become acclimatized to warm weather conditions. So acclimation is a reversible phenotype change over the lifespan of one individual organism. And so we see that in some cases, different organisms can change their camouflage pattern as they move from one ecosystem to another. We see this in things like different fish species that when they're young, they might have one coloration pattern as they hide in a salt marsh or in a mangrove swamp. And then when they come out as adults into the open ocean, they get a different coloration. We can see that they can change and adapt to changes in temperature or pH or salinity tolerance. Again, depending upon the environment in which they find themselves. All of our kind of fish that are spawned in freshwater environments and then go to grow and mature in saltwater environments experience acclimation from those different salinity regimes as they grow and mature. In the case of our stingray here, we're looking at the ambient temperature of the environment. It goes way down in wintertime and then it gets a lot warmer in spring and summertime. The maximum kind of temperature at which this organism can exist goes up in summertime and it dips down again in wintertime. Okay. It has this kind of adaptability to the environment in which it lives. Okay. Organisms do this by expressing different genes to different extent or turning on and off different genes within their particular genomes. This is perhaps most easily seen in things like winter wheat, which switch out the phospholipids that they use in their plasma membranes depending upon the seasonality and the temperature changes. They'll swap in phospholipids that have a lower freezing point in winter so that their cells don't freeze. They'll pop in then phospholipids that have a higher melting point essentially in summertime so that their cells don't fall apart. That happens every year as that organism is alive, okay? It's changing back and forth between these two possibilities. That's acclimation. Its ability to acclimatize is an adaptive trait of that organism, okay? And very often, acclimations are things that are not heritable. They're things that happen in somatic body cells, but they're not necessarily passed on to offspring. And so, for instance, when I lived in Florida, I became very acclimatized to warm weather. It wasn't a big deal to be out in the heat. Now, if it gets over 90 degrees, I'm like freaking out all the time. I'm like, it's really hot, and I start pouring down sweat, and I get blushy, and my hair frizzes out. Like, I used to live in 90-degree weather year round and didn't think it was a big deal. I have acclimatized. I've not passed on that trait to my kids. Like, they still have to acclimatize on their own. Okay, everybody get it? It's common to use adaptation when we're talking about acclimatization. And that adaptation has a very specific evolutionary impact that acclimatization doesn't have. Yeah.
When you were giving example of you like living like where, like in a hot weather, which places?
So I did my undergrad work in Tallahassee, Florida. And before that, I lived for like 2 decades, right, in Alabama and Arkansas.
But like if you live in for a long period of time in cold weather, like
Yes. Oh, yeah.
you had to get it again adapted to
Yes,
it.
exactly. So like my parents, for example, Midwesterners, went to the South for that same period of time that I was there, and then they have since moved back to northern Minnesota. And they run around in like shorts and a t-shirt and sandals when it's like 30 degrees Fahrenheit out. And I'm like, what, are you not freezing? They're like, I know, it feels good. And I'm like, are you crazy? No, they've acclimatized to that temperature scene. Yeah.
Okay, so for like protective camouflage things that animals can like automatically change their color, like due to like literally like
Right.
you're saying like the stingray that goes over and like
Or like an
dark color.
octopus or like a
Yeah.
flounder that
Yeah.
can change their shape. I would say that that's not true acclimatization. That's just an adaptive trait of that organism, is that they have that instantaneous camouflage ability. If they have permanent changes kind of to their skin cell coloration as they move from environment to environment, then it would be acclimatization or acclimation.
You think it probably started as an acclimation, they're the ones that slowly.
Oh yeah, the ones that had a mutation that let them control their chromatophores to a greater extent, of course, did better and survived longer and made more babies. And so then they became a greater portion of the gene pool. And over time, maybe we'll see organisms that do this type of color change acclimation. You know, they get a mutation and all of a sudden they start acting like octopus in terms of being able to really radically change skin color and texture.
So adaptations are heritable?
Yes.
Acclimations
Are not. Yeah. Your ability to acclimate might be heritable, but an individual's particular acclimation to its environment is usually not heritable.
So like when a rabbit changes its fur from winter to colors from winter to summer,
Yeah,
is that an acclimation?
that's
Or-
acclimation for that
Well,
individual.
that's an adapted
It's an
acclimation.
adaptive over the whole population. of
Yeah,
rabbits.
Okay. That's
And if you have a
adaptive.
rabbit that like has a mutation and it can't do it, right? It can't change fur color. I don't know that.
Acclimation.
Yeah, then it's gonna get eaten and die. Falls out of the population. And again, like I said, we don't tend to confuse acclimation with adaptation, but we use adaptation all the time when we're talking about acclimation. So it's like, is that really? It's got to be. So for us in our class, just be aware of this. If you get into evolutionary biology, like you'll have whole like people go on rants about it. Cool. Okay. All right. The kind of interesting one that comes into question then is that when we're thinking about clines or ecotypes, where are we on the scale of adaptation or acclimation? And that we often have what we call ring species, where we have changing environmental conditions in a close geographic area. And we can start to see that there are different species in the little pockets, microclimates of changing environmental conditions. But they're really close species relatives. You know, they're the same genera. We can see that they have close ancestry. They may be capable of interbreeding across these different species in these kind of ring associations of changing environmental conditions. Are we actually looking at adaptation to environmental conditions? Or are we looking at acclimations, just different expression rates of very similar genotypes through this region? And so some ecologists are likely to call these types of local variations actually different species and identify them as such. Other ecologists might look at the same set of species and say, well, that's just a cline. of changing kind of adaptability and genetics over changing environmental. In the case of these salamanders, which are kind of in a region just south of us, they all look really different. They are existing in slightly different microclimates, but you can interbreed them. Okay? Like, they're close enough to allow for gene flow. Whether or not that gene flow actually happens is a big ecological question then for these species. Because if gene flow is stopped, then you're starting to get those reproductive isolates, and you're starting to get true species. And so in this case, we often talk about these groups of organisms like ecotypes, or this term as I mentioned, ring species, where you get this kind of ring of gradating changes in species as you move through a particular environmental variation. In this case would be salamanders. They've got different moisture regimes, and some of it is based on different altitudes. You know, they live in a particular altitude band in the Appalachian foothills that has a particular moisture temperature regime that's different than the valley next to them. And in those two places, you can get different species.
You're gonna ask us to differentiate that acclimation and adaptation.
That might be a great question on an exam, and you know, I haven't made the exam yet. I'll be honest, it's next week. Whether that's a short answer question or if I give it to you, I might give it to you as a multiple choice. You know, give you a definition of one, but then. Okay. All right. The last thing that I want you to consider about evolutionary adaptations, and we're going to expound upon it as we talk about autotrophs and heterotrophs in the next couple of lectures, is this idea of trade-off. And that for every adaptation, for every adaptive trait, there's often a cost that comes to that organism. You might be more fit in one aspect of your biology that can cost you and make you less fit in other arenas. And this again is that idea that we talked about, that very few organisms are perfect, okay? Like they may be great at finding a mate, but then they're bad at getting food resources or escaping predators. And so there's always this kind of trade-off in evolutionary adaptations. In the case of all those Galapagos finches that we talked about that had, as they had that drought instance, and we saw an increase in the birds that had a big beak so they could get at the drought-resistant seeds that were being produced, there's a trade-off to that. Even though you can survive the drought, you're restricting yourself to a really specialized diet. And when you have a specialized diet, it means that it's harder for you to access other things in your environment. And because of that, then other species, other populations might creep in and start to invade your space. And that means then that you're competing, maybe not necessarily for food, but you're competing for habitat space, places to build your nests. More individuals like you bring in more predators. And so what seemed like a good idea, and definitely got you through one period of evolutionary history, might not be so great the next time around. What we're also going to see in organisms is that very often a larger body size can be helpful to you in terms of accessing more resources and gaining kind of a bigger footprint in an ecosystem. But as with these birds, a larger beak with a bigger body means you got to eat more to maintain that bigger size. And that in getting big, you might have restricted yourself in diet, which means that actually you're not doing so hot. You got to find more of those big seeds in order to maintain your big body size. And now you can't eat the little seeds. So there's a trade-off. It's a balance. What is the biggest beak I can maintain and actually still maintain it? That's the limit of what's happening in that ecosystem. Very often, as we saw in the evolution of that antibiotic resistance in E. coli and that agar gel, they got to access the new portion of the gel, but in evolving antibiotic resistance, they often lose some of their metabolic process. Either they can't pick up certain types of carbohydrates from their environment, they actually metabolize slower because they have to chew on this antibiotic and fight it off, makes them more susceptible to viruses in their environment, even though the antibiotic isn't killing them anymore. There's a trade-off to what happens. We'll see it time and time again in birds as we talk about them throughout the semester. Bright coloration attracts mates, gets you more of your genes into the next generation, but you have to maintain it. And to maintain that bright coloration, to maintain that big, beautiful peacock tail, you have to gain resources. And if you can't get to the resources, you're not going to get the mates either. And so there's this trade-off. If you want to maintain your genes, you have to spend energy getting resources too. And so it's that idea of how big can I make my tail? How bright can I get in terms of the red color of a cardinal before I get picked off too much, before there's actually not enough resources to give me the coloration to attract a female.
Is it like the one where you said there's like a right fish?
Oh yeah, like the right-handed fish and the left mouth fish and the right mouth fish.
Yeah.
And that, if again, it's this idea of frequency dependent selection, that like at first you have an advantage because the other guy is dominant in the population and the fish aren't looking out for you. But then you increase in frequency because of that, and then you're selected. It's kind of it's always a trade-off. Like you might have an advantage in one situation, but it may not last. Okay, does everybody get it? I always kind of think of it again in terms of humans, that like you might put a lot of resources into getting a mate, but then you have to keep them. Like once you set out a certain amount of assumptions that your mate is going to have, like then you have to meet those assumptions of what's going to happen. And if you show off more than you can actually do, you might not keep that mate. Hopefully that's not actually what happens with you and your partner, but in the early stages, that. All right. Overall, we see that fitness is a function of the current environmental conditions. What's good now and adaptive might not always be adaptive. And that as environmental conditions change right now for organisms, they're in a state of evolutionary flux. And as temperatures change, as water resources change, as plant populations are changing across the landscape, lots of organisms are running up against not only changes in their tolerance limits, but they're running up against the need to adapt and evolve very quickly. And an organism's genotype will limit its phenotype and thus its ability to adapt to a particular environment or condition. And so you're constrained by that. There's only so much that a population or a species can do given its genetics. And that for most species then, they're waiting on mutation in order to randomly change them to allow for adaptation. And this is where biodiversity gets really interesting and really exciting as a topic, in that we have to not only maintain, different genotypes and species within our ecosystems for them to be resilient and adaptable, but those species have to have a certain amount of genetic variability in order to be able to meet changes over evolutionary time.
Is it different have starfish?
They are. These are all different kinds of starfish. These are illustrations by Ernst Haeckel, one of the ecologists that was on the Little Worksheet. I like him because he's like a 1700s kind of like Norwegian kind of Scandinavian dude, and he loved looking at different organisms, and he made these incredible drawings of them. He like etched. He was in the age of the like etching, and you would like etch it into like a plate of metal, and then you make a whole bunch of prints of it. So it's really cool. And so he has, there's probably 150 of these types of sketches that he's done of taking different groups of organisms and doing the biodiversity. So like the thing in the middle is the basket star, which is a certain type of starfish, kind of in Hunter. And then these are actually some of the larval stages that you see in the upper panels, and some of the adults in different mouth parts in the bottom. In developmental biology, we really like to study the urchins and starfish because they make a lot of gametes at a time, and they broadcast pollen so you can collect them and put them together in whatever ratios you want. So we kill pretty quickly in fish or lab tank. We do a lot of developmental biology and kind of basic genetic working materials. Okay, all right. Let's talk for the rest of the class about plants. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on like what makes a plant a plant. Kind of going to feel like you got the feel for that. Animals that live on land have some basic, animals and plants, I should say, organisms, have some basic evolutionary challenges that they all have to meet. They all have to get access to energy. All organisms need access to water. All organisms have to adapt to temperature changes, or they have to have evolved to be homotherms and be resilient to temperature changes around them. And they all have to get access to matter. Okay, kind of remember that energy and matter are two different things. You can solve it the same way. We'll see that plants and animals have the two classic solutions to energy and matter. But in essence, we're looking at two different things. And in some cases, particularly with plants, when we talk about getting access to matter, it's really about nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus access more than carbon access, which is what drives a lot of what happens in the animals. And so the basic ways that organisms solve these problems starts to categorize and define them into different groups of organisms, both ecologically as well as phylogenetically and taxonomically. And the easiest one of that, of course, is to recognize that different organisms have solved the energy problem differently. Okay? And in plants, they're autotrophs. And they've decided that they can make their own energy by harnessing either light or chemical energy to do that. And in animals, they've decided to get their energy by eating other types of organic matter. Okay? And those are the two big first order adaptations that we see in organisms evolutionarily, is how are you going to get energy to run your cell and remain organized and to grow and reproduce? You can either be an autotroph or you can be a heterotroph. Okay, so everything has to have energy. Everything has to have access to organic matter in order to run cellular respiration. You can get that organic matter and that energy in two basic ways. Okay, how you get access to that organic matter matters. You can be an autotroph, which means you take inorganic carbon, usually carbon dioxide, and you transform it into organic carbon, usually carbohydrates, that you then respire in your cells, okay, to get more energy. If you're an autotroph, you're a producer, often a primary producer in your ecosystem. Today, we're really interested in photoautotrophs, ones that use photosynthesis and light energy in order to generate organic matter and energy for themselves. Heterotrophs are where we're going to spend a lot of the rest of the semester talking about, and they're our consumers. They use already existing organic matter as the starting point for cellular respiration. And the two processes, photosynthesis and heterotroph cellular respiration, are linked to each other on big biosphere scales, in that photoautotrophs take in carbon dioxide and they give out oxygen, and heterotrophs take in oxygen and they give back out carbon dioxide. And so these processes are in balance with each other on big scales in terms both of energy use and production and organic matter cycling. And when we throw in biogeochemical cycles, we see too that nutrient uptake of plants, should provide for the nutrients and organic matter that's needed by heterotrophs in a system. And that what photoautotrophs do in terms of carbon dioxide fixation and nutrient uptake sets how much is available for heterotrophs in any given ecosystem. When everything dies, and we'll talk about decomposition later on, it restarts this cycle of what's available for autotrophs. Okay, everybody's with me? And again, sometimes what species is there really matters to the amount of photosynthesis that's done. From an ecological perspective, we just want to know what the bulk photosynthetic rate is, how much organic matter is produced, how much fixed carbon there is in an ecosystem. It becomes less important sometimes which species are actually present. Okay. In general, photosynthesis happens like this. We take in carbon dioxide and water. Using light energy as a catalyst, we make organic matter, which is glucose here. We put out oxygen and more water. I'm not going to ask you to give me the equation for photosynthesis. Okay, that's, hopefully you heard about it in biology. If you get really into plant biology and botany, it will become the foundation of your life. Because you'll be very interested in how much CO2 is available and how much water, because it influences how much organic matter. Okay. What I do want you to recognize is that this process of photosynthesis requires light and carbon dioxide and water. So from a plant perspective, that's what they're evolving towards, is maximizing access to light and carbon dioxide and water. Okay, those are the evolutionary challenges they have to meet, or else they can't grow and reproduce. So they use photosynthesis in order to grow and reproduce. And so they have to have access to those things on the one side of the equation for photosynthesis. They must also have access to nutrients in order to build more body structure and to be able to reproduce. And so those, again, from an autotroph perspective, are the four things they have to have: light, water, carbon dioxide, and nutrients. And they're going to show then different adaptations for gaining access to those base resources. We see the output of those adaptations as different species of photoautotrophs. Okay, all right. So in general, photoautotrophs grow to change. In heterotrophs, in animals, they move to change. And they have a different adaptation pattern than plants. Because plants are rooted in one spot for the most part, their ability for adaptation is different than an organism that can just fly to a better resource condition. A plant has to essentially adapt to the conditions in which it finds itself. And part of that is that if it's not in the right conditions, it won't ever even grow and start to try to adapt in that environment. So photoautotrophs, they alter their body structure to respond to these environmental changes. They grow to change. And so we can see this as phenotype plasticity, as we saw in the plant previously, where under different conditions, it's going to grow and allocate biomass differently because its environment is different. It is growing to change and respond. As we talk today, just keep in mind that there's stuff below ground in a plant. There's its root system. Its root system is what gives it access to water and nutrients and soil. What's above ground, the leaves and the stems, the flowers, the fruits, the seeds, that's part of the shoot system of the plant. And the shoot system provides access to carbon dioxide and light. And so the two different parts of the plant are aimed at achieving different evolutionary goals. The root system does other stuff too, right? Like it anchors the plant. We can store biomass there, we'll talk about. The shoot system does other stuff, right? It provides structure and support, provides a seed dispersal mechanism, it provides reproductive processes. But again, on this base level, the two different parts of the plant are aimed at and have evolved and adapted for different pressures and to meet different challenges. All right, so let's start with light. And there are a few things that I want you to appreciate about plants and their relationship to light. There's a few different pieces of terminology that definitely we run into in our textbook and that we will run into in the field of plant ecology. When we go out to look at plants and how they're adapting in their environment, these are some of the base things that we measure. It's about light access and light properties. And we've been measuring it when we go out into the field as PAR, as photosynthetically active radiation. What is the actual amount of light that is available to the plant? And that's going to vary season, latitude. Okay, we know that that amount of quantity of light varies. In general, the more light there is, the more photosynthesis and plant there can be. without the light, the plant can't be there and it cannot photosynthesize at a base level. We'll see that, we saw it when we did our little soil experiment. There was more light out in the field, there was less light in the understory forest. There are radically different amounts of plants on the ground in those two ecosystems. First and foremost, because there's different amounts of light. For plants, very often something that becomes important is what we call the light compensation point, or LCP. And that is the light level at which the amount of photosynthetically active radiation that's available provides for enough photosynthesis to equal the amount of respiration that the plant itself does. Okay. Remember that photosynthesis allows the plant to fix carbon. It then has to respire that carbon to get energy to do everything else for the plant. And so you have to have a base level of light in order to meet your own respiration needs. And if there's not enough light for that, you'll die. Okay, maybe not right away, but over a period of time. Okay. This is really important in aquatic environments. If single-celled little phytoplankton spend too much time deep in the water column, they won't get enough light and they'll die. Okay. There's too much mixing. If the light penetration is too shallow, you'll run out of photosynthetic algae, and that can really change your food web on a very big level. Okay, that's at the bottom level of light availability. There's also usually for every plant and photoautotrope a maximum level of photosynthesis and light that it can do. And so there's usually a maximum light level, a light saturation point, which is when the PAR level is at the max for what that plant can do in terms of photosynthesis. And for many plants, when light levels get beyond the saturation point, they actually start to hurt the plant. And that the plant has to start spending resources essentially trying to block the excess light to dissipate that excess incoming energy rather than photosynthesize. And that's what happens when we have photoinhibition, when the light levels get too high. That can actually depress the photosynthetic rate. And so again, different plants then will show different tolerances and have different light compensation points and different saturation points. And that can be adapted for different latitudes. It can be acclimatized for different seasons at a given latitude. We have been going out and measuring PAR, just kind of general amount of light that's in an ecosystem. If we were to taxonomically identify really carefully the species of plants that we are encountering and then go look up their light compensation points and light saturation points, we would see that those prairie organisms have very different tolerances for light than the organisms that are growing in the forest understory. Okay, so talk to your neighbor, see if you can come up with some ways that we talked about some of these in class on Friday. What are some ways that plants maximize their access to light? How do they get more light? If you're a plant and you want to get the most light, what do you do?
The leaves, the angle. Them leave angles. You go tall. Yeah, like
We gotta be like,
yeah.
well, it'll be like 1.5 days.
Yeah, like the large.
It's already like
Yeah, the leaf size. And like go large. Oh yeah, like more surface area. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay. Beaver fur. I could sleep on it. Like, I have long been a person that's like, how could you kill a beaver and like make something out of his fur? That's like the absolute level of cruelty, right? And then I like got some beaver fur and I was like, holy cow.
This is the stuff that's big.
I get
Like-
it now.
I get it now.
I don't know.
That beaver.
Like that is.
This is fox fur.
That lady probably has so many people from PETA like writing her.
I know. Like I was really ambivalent about buying it because I definitely was like, I don't really want to support people's like fur section. I don't know how they.
So this is like a fall.
Almost like-
More.
I like that
It's
better. This one's pretty neat.
Yeah, I like a far.
My mom actually had a
You
pet
can
dog
totally tell
before.
that the water like just beats up and rolls off.
Exactly.
It's almost like thick.
Well, if it's dead already, so
Yeah, this is the bobcat. Here, I'll switch. Okay, what are some ways that plants can maximize their access to light?
this feels like I'm petting a
More leaves. So
More leaves.
more leaves. The shape of their leaf, right?
Protest.
The angle.
The angle they hold their leaves. Good. How fast they grow and their height. Right. Okay. And so those are all things that we see. Different species have different leaf structure, have different leaf shapes. They hold their leaves differently. They grow at different rates. They grow to different heights as an adaptation to getting more light in their environment. So to maximize light, any given plant can increase the number of leaves they have. They can increase the individual leaf area, the shape of the leaf, how it is held at a particular angle, and they can increase their height. And different plants under different conditions will acclimatize what's available to them within their genotype. And then different species, due to different genetics, show different abilities to maximize them. And those are, that's what we see in plants. Like, this is how they vary. Okay, we'll go out and we identify plants. This is what we look at. What does their leaf look like? How many leaves do they have? Are they, how are their leaves arranged? What color are they? How tall is this plant? Those are some of these like speciation things. All right, cool. What I want you to appreciate is that growing taller, having more leaves, having a greater leaf area has a trade-off evolutionarily, okay? That even though those things are great for the plant to do those things, because they can have more light to do more photosynthesis, they can grow bigger and reproduce more, there are consequences that can be negative to growth and reproduction for that plant too, as it maximizes leaves, surface area, and height. And one of the first things that it has to balance is temperature. And that as the leaf gets broader, as the leaf is exposed to more sunlight, because it has grown taller, has more of them, it heats up. Okay. And so if you get too hot, you can melt yourself, okay? There are other consequences to getting too hot. You can lose too much moisture. And that then can impede actually your growth and reproduction. So broad, thick leaves like the sycamore here, they receive lots of light, but they have poor temperature regulation. Because you have a bunch of that internal space that has little or no airflow, it heats up a lot, and that can impede growth and reproduction. In the oak leaf, we have all these lobes, and they tend to be more slender, and so they have kind of more places for air and water to cool the leaf. And so because of that, they have less surface area as a leaf, so they're going to get less light, but they don't heat up nearly as much, and they can regulate temperature better. And so actually they can grow and reproduce just fine, even though they have lower surface area. The sycamore tree might make fewer leaves, but then the oak tree might make more leaves in order to make up for that difference in surface area and the problems with temperature regulation. The bottom little part here is just showing you as you move out towards the edges of the leaf of both of these guys, it gets a lot cooler. It's really hard to maintain the proper temperature for the plant on the interior of the leaf. They can't like wave their leaves around on purpose to cool them off, or like they don't sweat. They can't like lick their leaves in order to get evaporative cooling, okay? But they can play with leaf shape and size and thickness in order to respond to temperature. Okay. The oak trees are going to do better in higher temperatures potentially than the sycamore trees. So given climate change, you might see some shifts in forest composition due to this base factor.
Would you say bark, tree bark was a play into how like
I'm not really sure.
our height there's like some trees that were like had really defined, really deep bark.
Oh, yeah.
And there's some that are just like really smooth. And I didn't know if light
Usually-
and moisture had anything to play into that. Or if
It has more of a moisture role, the bark.
Like
I
training.
think the bird got it on me.
Yeah. It has more of that than light, because there isn't any photosynthesis happening in those types of cells. A lot of it too is predator defense. And so it's gonna be a bit in response to other organisms in the environment, that type of adaptation. Okay. So the more light, the higher the temperature. The other thing to remember is that just like with our kind of big-billed finches earlier, the higher the temperature, the more body you have, the higher your respiration rate is. And because you have a higher respiration rate, you need to do more photosynthesis. And so you can see how if you start out with a big broadleaf, you're going to be higher temperature, you're going to do more respiration. You actually need a big broadleaf in order to photosynthesize enough to keep up with that. And that's fine until your respiration exceeds your photosynthetic ability, until the light level gets too high and the temperature heats up too much. And this is where we start to talk about tolerances and those kind of ecological niches of different species. And that their adaptations to get light limit where they can actually physically exist. Okay. And so again, we see different adaptations, we see different leaf shape and structure depending upon the local environments and changes in these broad scale kind of patterns. There's an optimal temperature for each species at which it can balance photosynthesis and respiration and maximize photosynthesis. And so again, the sycamore tree does well in our region because we have relatively moderate temperatures. It's too hot for them in their particular leaf structure as they go farther south. Make sense? Okay. The other kind of leaf trade-off, maximizing light scenario that I want you to consider is that at the same time as a given plant is trying to balance leaf morphology to get light for photosynthesis and temperature, it's also balancing moisture loss. And that as the plant is trying to maximize photosynthesis, in order to do that, it's got to have a leaf. So it's going to have some temperature things it has to consider. And then as it heats up, it has more evaporation out of that leaf. And so this has to do with the opening and closing of the stomata, the little pores on the leaf that let in carbon dioxide. And you have to do that again to photosynthesize. That's how they get access to carbon dioxide. But at the same time that the stomata is open to let carbon dioxide in, it's letting water vapor out. And that can help with temperature to evaporate more. But it also means then that you need more water in order to balance water loss. So the higher the temperature, the more water loss you're going to have through those stomata. And this means then that you have to balance now temperature, photosynthesis, and water loss. And you have to find the sweet spot for your particular environmental conditions. Okay. And so again, the tolerance varies. And that some species can withstand a lot of water loss under high temperature regimes, and some species can't. They've made this trade-off for what they're going to do. And again, the more leaves you have, the broader they are, the more sensitive you might be to evaporation rate and water loss. And this is all affected by how much moisture is actually available down in the soil. So different organisms are adapted for different climatic and weather conditions. And that if you have really wet conditions, you could have a big broad leaf because you're going to get enough moisture replenishment to balance evaporation rate. If you live in drier conditions, you might be able to have a big leaf. It might not be that hot, but it's too dry for you to actually be able to do that. And so these are selective pressures then on the kind of things that are possible with different plant genomes. Okay, that makes sense for everybody. Here we see that we have different net photosynthetic rates for different types of their trees, really. You can see that some of them are able to tolerate less water than other ones. Okay, so these have to grow in a wetter environment than kind of our oak trees do. They can withstand a greater loss of water. This also starts to play into things like climate change, because now we're thinking about what species are going to do well as freshwater availability changes, as precipitation rates change. What is that going to mean then for community dynamics when the base photoautotrophs change? Is there a way that we can manage communities in order to allow them to adapt quickly and easily to climate change? And it turns out beavers can do that. That's why I had the guy talk about beavers last class, because they actually help to store water in ecosystems and can help kind of fight these. They can not necessarily fight climate change, but they can moderate the extent to which climate change can affect. Okay, we will pick up talking about autotrophs in class on Thursday. We are in chapter 7 or 6 and 7 in our textbook. I will start to talk a little bit, hopefully, about heterotrophs. Hopefully, we'll do some temperature heterotroph adaptations on Thursday as well. Thanks, guys. Take more food with you.